We are now going to have a panel discussion, so we'll tease out some of the themes that we've talked about during session one. So I'd like to welcome back to the stage our speakers from session one. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Tony Buffler from AJB Sports Management, Simon Hong from SK Innovation, and Simon Yu from EY, who will moderate the discussion.
안녕하십니까. Hi everyone, thank you for your time this morning, and thank you to all the presenters for a great insight into your relationship with Korean partners. I'd like to just make a quick comment about David Nathan's observation about how far the city is from the airport. Actually, I've actually been to CHA headquarters because PwC apparently have helped with on the buy side, on the sell side, sorry, but EY has helped with the buy side, on the CHA side. So I've had an opportunity to go to your Brisbane headquarters as well as to your Korea CHA headquarters. And guess where it is for my Korean colleagues here? It's in Bundang. So that is a pretty far way out. It's actually not classified as Seoul, it's actually Gyeonggi-do. So even from Yeouido, it cost me, I think about 50,000 won in taxi ride. So you can imagine how far that is from Incheon Airport. But perhaps I'll get back to the presenters and make some observations and questions about your presentations. But I would like to give our panelists who haven't had a chance to present this morning a chance to perhaps give their insight into dealing with Korean and Australian cultural differences. Sorry, my eyes are aging, so I have to take my glasses off. So first of all, I'd like to start with Tony and introduce him to the audience. So Tony Buffler is the Managing Director of AJB Sports Management and manages professional golfers. He manages some of Australia's leading golfers, including Carrie Webb, Jared Lyle, Robert Allenby, John Sendin, Greg Chalmers, and Craig Perry. Some of those names I'm sure you would recognize. Additionally, he assists with the promotion of Australian golf tournaments, including player and sponsorship procurement. Tony is involved in re-establishing the Australian Ladies Masters Golf Tournament, which would involve bringing a number of Korean lady professional golfers to Australia to compete in their off-season. So that is a very exciting initiative, which I'm sure the audience would like to hear more about this morning. But so over to you, Tony. Before I ask you some questions, would you like to perhaps talk about the Ladies Masters Golf first?
Absolutely, thanks Simon. Yeah, the Ladies Masters is a fairly specific event. Obviously, through Korea's cold winters, their players are hitting in driving ranges and other things, and they aren't actually playing golf outside. And basically, for the months of December, January, February, and into March, they're quite contained in that environment. So the KLPGA the schedule is full, which is great. So the only times that, and that starts roughly April through to November. So we've got the concept of having a back-to-back tournaments with the Australian Women's Open, which is on in Adelaide in the middle of February, to reintroduce the Australian Ladies Masters. It would be a combined Korean and Australian and a few European players. We've got support from the Brisbane government, Brisbane City Council and the Queensland government, Events Queensland, and we're nearly there. We just we've got TV, live TV into JTBC Golf in Korea, and there's a lot of things that you need. You need a tournament, you need course, you need TV, you need production, you need players, and you need, of course, sponsorship. So there's a lot of balls in the air, and we hope to have an announcement in the next 2 weeks. But yes, the concept was to bring the Korean players down here, which has a small amount of economic activity, but the main activity would be the TV rights. And so yes, we're trying to do that, and hopefully we're successful in the next few weeks.
That's very interesting. Thanks, Tony. So, so how do you hope that this event will bring closer, given today's topic is about bringing two countries closer together? How do you hope that this event will bring Australia and Korea bilateral relationship closer together?
Well, I won't only just discuss that event. I've got a few general notes here, and harking back a little bit, it's interesting the Macquarie Group started in 2000 in Korea. You know, people like to do business in places that are safe, peaceful, supportive governments and development boards. And I go back to the 1988 Seoul Olympics, where Korea was showcased to the world. Before that, there was some business being done, but nowhere near to the extent that it is today. And that's showcased Korea throughout the world on a major TV audience, plus all the documentaries and postcards of life and culture behind the scenes that shown on TV. And so that really was telling the world that Korea is open for business. Sydney 12 years later did the same thing, where the 2000 Olympics, and announced to the world that we're certainly open for business. And it's interesting that Macquarie Group only started in Korea in 2000. And so those things announced to the world that, you know, it's peaceful, it's safe, you know, you organise your conference here, trade, delegations, etc. And so harking back to sport, yes, it does lead directly to economic trade and development, but it's got a longevity that lasts forever. More recently, the Pyongyang Olympic Games, you know, no one really remembers who won the men's and women's downhill racing, but the lasting memory is the two Koreas coming together, and that it is safe and they're open for business as well. And so the general theme is that, you know, if you've got that environment, then people will invest, people will trade, and people will watch TV, and sponsors will support it. Sponsors wouldn't support it if it wasn't leading to trade. So indirectly, all these events, you know, the Australian Open tennis recently, when the young Korean player got to the semi-finals, the whole of Korea were watching the Australian Open tennis. So they're seeing Kia as a sponsor, all the other sponsors, they're seeing Melbourne, Australia, So there's a massive flow and effect between the two countries over a single event, you know, again around sport. And that leads to tourism, it leads to conferences, it leads to investment indirectly. You know, Kia wouldn't put their $15 million, whatever they do, into the Australian Open tennis if it didn't have a payback. And so and other examples are the Asian Cup soccer is now growing, particularly Australian as now competitive as is Korea. They're playing in World Cup soccer events, and so that drives a TV audience, sponsorship, trade, conferences, the whole lot, tourism. So and so that golf event, getting back to your question, is another extension of that. So it's not at that size, of course, but you know, there will be, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people coming down here, and caddies and support staff and parents and all that sort of stuff from Korea. There will be some economic activity, nothing to the extent of the ones I mentioned just then, but you've got to build these things and they grow. I mean, the Ryder Cup is on shortly in Paris, and if you're in the golf space, everyone around the world will be watching that. It wasn't like that 50 years ago. It takes time to build. And so, you know, we are not even in the Ryder Cup, but you know, most golfers around the world will take some notice of that. You know, the tickets sold out overnight. It's interesting that the British Open next year at Royal Portrush is already sold out, never sold out before. So these events obviously take time to build as economic activity and cultural things around them. So just some examples of your question of, you know, is it diplomacy? Sort of. It leads to trade, to economic activity, tourism, and goodwill between nations.
Thanks, Tony. I think you preempted my question. about the importance of sports diplomacy and its critical role in bringing two countries together. So thank you for your insight into that. I might move on to Mr. Simon Hong, who is the Managing Director at SK Networks, not SK Innovation. Let me just introduce Simon. Simon Hong is the Managing Director of SK Networks Resources Australia, which is a subsidiary of the SK Group, SK Networks in particular, one of the top 4 chaebols in Korea. SK NRA has an underground thermal coal mining investment in Australia, in New South Wales in fact, and Simon has been in Australia for the past 5 years, of which he has spent 2 years in Queensland and the last 3 years as Managing Director of SK NRA here in Sydney. So Simon, if you could please take your memory back to when you first arrived in Australia. In your working relationship with various business partners, such as investment partners, banks, accounting, and legal service providers, could you share with us 2 or 3 things that really stood out for you as being very different to those counterparts in Korea, which you were accustomed to dealing with in Korea? And what did you do to overcome those differences?
I cannot remember. My name is Simon Hong, and I'm from SK Networks, not SK Innovation. So, Reese, when did you meet SK Innovation guy? That's a joke. So, I just wanna. So there are so many differences between Australia and Korea. I can share maybe 100 points, but at this moment I can share 3 things. And the first thing is, I guess, the priority issues. The Australian, the priority is on the family and the personal life, whereas the Korean, our priority is on the work. Obviously, it's changing these days. There is a new word in Korea, wora there, which means the work-life balance. So younger generation in Korea is counting the personal life and family than the work. But generally, we count work as our priority thing. So when I was in Brisbane, I worked actually in a foreign company, which is not the SK office, but I was seconded to our invested company, and I worked as a team member of that company. So maybe it's a very true experience as a Australian Korean culture. At the time, for example, on every Friday afternoon after 2 p.m., I was the last person who left in the office. So that's the Brisbane. It's more, general, the liberal than New South Wales, I think. Yeah. But in Korea, if we have something to do at the workplace, we don't go home. We just work until it finishes. But Australian, it's not because they don't take responsibility on their work, but they count their family and their personal life more important than work. So what I was doing was, I was chasing by the head office at the time for a lot of details and a lot of information. Maybe there are a lot of managing directors here and employees who was sent from Korea, and maybe you got a lot of experiences that a lot of calls from Korea is coming at maybe 5 p.m., 6 p.m. and it doesn't work in Australia. So I actually make a list for the urgent matters and requested to the Australian guy first thing in the morning, and they can be resolved on that day. Otherwise, you cannot expect the things that can be resolved on that day. So that was what I'm doing. And I actually naturally accepted the way of Australian life. And yeah, after maybe 6 months, I went home earlier and sleep here at 4 p.m. And obviously, I finished my work before that, believe it or not. And second thing is, this is the sequence problem. So as Julian mentioned, we build relationship first before we speak. Very important thing, especially in the business meeting. But Australian, they just get into the point directly and very straightforward. Relationship is important still, but can be built later. I actually, when I was in the meeting in the first or second year of Australia, I realized that I needed to be more straightforward. Otherwise, the Australian just asked me, "So what's the point? Or what's your point? So what?" But yeah, at that time, in Korea, it can be considered as impolite if younger people speak to older people very directly, very straightforward. Even in the business meeting, they can be considered as impolite. But in Australia, that's not the fact. So yeah, I turned to a more straightforward person. Yeah, so that was my solution. Number three is, how was that? My memory is becoming, it's old, even I'm not that old. So yeah, I guess there is an authority issues between Australia and Korea. I felt that the empowerment in Australia is more general to the junior level employee, but in Korea, everything should go to a very high level CEO or just below CEO. So it takes a lot of time to get an approval, even for minor things. So I got a lot of experiences that when I have a meeting with Australian, they always say, not always, but normally say, "Okay, I can do it. It's doable." But later, it turned out that they just called me that, and I found that it's not working. Yeah, so they need to discuss with the other department and other senior level management. So my solution on that was every time I hear important thing in my business, I requested email confirmation or letter. And if I request that, then they say, "Okay, let me consider," or "Let me discuss with the other guys." So that was my solution. And I think for Australian, when you do a business with Korean, it's not a good idea to put someone into a situation where they have to make a spot decision. So it doesn't work. So give him some time to consider, and it can work. And generally, the best way, I think, to overcome the differences between Australia and Korea was sharing the experiences, and especially the extreme version of experiences of each other's culture. So in my case, I actually bought a lot of barbecue and went to a second round and had a lot of soju and sing a song and some further stories. And so after that, I realized that a lot of Australians like that kind of occasions. Yeah. So in Korea, let me give you a tip. In Korea, especially men, we think that we can become a true friend only after we have those kind of dinner and second round and put arms with each other's, shoulders. So if you really want to become a true friend, then I recommend that you should have those sequences. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. That was very informative and entertaining at the same time. You might have covered it already, but although you're one of the youngest managing directors in the Korean business community, you're probably one of the longest serving. So what would your advice be to recently arrived or newly arriving managing directors or expats to Australia? I'm sure it was largely covered by your comments earlier, but if you have anything else to add, please do. If you don't, it's okay.
Yeah, I actually got an email from Simon Yu last night for this question. And the first question was actually, I got
don't
that
reveal
question.
our secrets.
But I just saw that email in the morning, so there was not enough time to think about. But I guess the first thing is the family, because your family came to Australia because of you. I mean, the main director or employee from Korea. And you are the most responsible person in your family. Obviously in Korea as well, but maybe your role here might be double or triple than Korea. So ceremony is extremely important, and school for children and your wife's social activities. And if your wife is happy, you will be happy. And it is very important thing to your business. And in the job place, workplace, I guess every managing director is looking at the future. So new business and new relationship, new networking, new volumes and new client. But I guess it may be very difficult to find new customers and new volumes. But maybe your capacity here is greater than in Korea as a managing director. So you have a good chance to investigate everything in the past, what was happening in this office. I'm not saying that you have to audit, the former managing director's behavior or former managing director's cost, but I'm saying that in business, every business has issues, and many issues unresolved. And I think a new person can create a new idea and new solution. So for example, I think I have two good examples. One is with EY actually. So we invested the thermocool asset here from 1990, and there were a lot of tax payment. And EY became our auditor from 2016. And as a newly appointed auditor, they investigated everything from the ground. And they found that there were several tax payment errors in the past. And at the time, we've made a decision that we investigate more in detail. So we've actually spent a lot of money to EY, so into one and a half year. But at the end of the day, we got 10 million refund from the ATO plus 2 million interest. So this is not 짜고 치는 고스톱 with EY. I don't know the proper expression on that in English, but yeah, that was a good example to look at the past cases. And there is another case. So we paid we received a invoice from our partner, and if I didn't investigate everything from the ground, we just paid it. But I found that there is a discrepancy between the contract and their invoice, and actually that was 4 years ago, and actually 3 years, Harvest Means 3 years is working for us to resolve that issue. But it turned out that $2 million payable US dollar payable is changing to $1 million receivable. So the point is that if you have to, if you look at the past, then you can find something which can be helpful for your business.
Okay. Thanks, Simon.
And the last one, enjoy the Australian life.
Great. Thanks, Simon. I didn't know where that EY story was going to go, so nervous, but thanks for the plug. So we're actually running out of time. I think we're supposed to finish by 11:30. Is that? I'm sorry? Yeah. So we might just hand it over to the audience to ask any questions you might like to put towards the panelists or to the presenters.
If you can put your hand up.
Let me ask Daniel, right, Mercury, yeah.
Yes.
From your very rich experience in Korea, I like you have spoken very well of the Korean, why they spoken in English and then well educated and. But what from your perspective, from Australian perspective, what do you desire? What do you want the Korean businessman to be desired, or want the Korean businessman to behave like?
Themselves, really. If you're getting into partnership with somebody, it's a long relationship. I've made great lifelong friends in my time in Korea, so I don't want anyone to be any different than how they are. And I think you spend time together and you understand whether you can or can't work together. And I think Simon made some comments on directness versus indirectness, and I think it was one thing I think some of my Korean partners found about me was that when I moved a meeting from 9 a.m. to 4:30, it meant I had bad news and I was going to take them to dinner and for a drink afterwards. So you adjust to the cultural norms. But I think it's not so much what would an Australian require more from a Korean business person, but I think whenever you're dealing with different cultures in exchange, you need to think much more carefully about your message and what is important to you. And you can't just sit around and have an hour-long conversation, or you can, but you have to keep reiterating the same very simple point so that you don't create confusion. And I think to the whole point on cultural difference as well, I'd never say to somebody, what's your point, or be very direct about the question. What I try to do is reframe what somebody had said. So if someone was saying something, I would say, well, what I think is important to you is you would like me to do X, Y, and Z. And then someone would respond to that. So I think it's not so much about what can a Korean business person do differently. I think it's about how do you respect each other culturally. And I think another example I would use was often if we had a decision to make or there was something important to discuss, I'd make sure our working teams had pre-meetings, everybody was well briefed, and you'd be flexible around the meeting time. So if someone needs more time, they just don't back anybody into a corner or put them in a position where they might lose face in front of their team or not be able to respond in the meeting. So I think it just requires a bit of sensitivity from both sides, and I'd say a bit of patience on the Korean side for what will invariably be too direct of a discussion anyway from an Australian.
Okay, one more question from the audience.
So I'm just a little bit relaxed now. I've never been I've never been in Mars in my life. I'm not really sure. But anyway, I just want to quickly mention about as a business banker. So I'm facing a lot of the new business to Australia, and especially in institutional corporate level of the business. The director of the business often stays not long term, but it's 3 or 4 years, or maximum maybe 5 years, a little bit longer. But every time the person who charge of the business is changing the banking sort of need. So when there is this disconnection of the information carrying to the next person, there's a lot of confusion, and there's a relationship sort of often be disconnected. So mindful that I think it's really important to just get to when it comes to the building a new business in Australia, just make sure what you need to get as identifications, or maybe what sort of information you need to bring to build that relationship with the banking, as well as the conveying the previous the directors or the managers of the authority, and the conversation need to be carried for the next person. So that relationship is so important. So we'll be just make it more easier to the business in Australia as well too. Yeah.
It always makes the job of the moderator easier when panelists volunteers an answer. Thank you. Thanks, Julianne. So one last question from the audience, because we need to finish up here.
Sorry, just a question for David. So you said the differences of dealing with Cha in terms of the directness and the power that he has within his organisation. How did you go and work with the your team in terms of assessing, the appropriateness of him to be a partner, given obviously the difference in doing business?
Well, we did have those criteria, and the important thing was to get the then 17 shareholder clinicians, because we moved from 4 to 17 as part of the transaction, to explain to them what the strengths and weaknesses were of all the competing bids, and to understand the cultural differences between those who were bidding out of South Korea versus those who were bidding elsewhere. And I felt entirely comfortable with Dr. Cha's approach and the Cha approach, but it was just helping them understand it, and that really meant getting as many of our clinicians up to Seoul as possible so that they could meet the Cha team and understand it directly, but it wasn't a problem.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it short there. The presentation and the comments by the panelists have been very insightful and useful. Thank you. Please give a round of applause to the presenters.
Thank you very much for that very entertaining and insightful panel. I think my number one key takeaway is that I look forward to an SK Network sponsored drinking session where we can all become true friends. Thank you also to Tony for joining us in the panel. I think sports diplomacy has a huge role to play between Australia and Korea, so we wish you the best of luck with your golf tournament, and we hope to see some of your professional Korean women golf come down to Australia to compete. I'd now like to invite the speakers just to stay on stage, and we'll have a photo in a minute, but I'd like to invite everybody else to enjoy some morning tea. We will just break for about 10 to 15 minutes, so if I can please ask everyone to come back here at 11:45, that would be fantastic when we start session 2. Thank you.